It's always a pleasure for our family to come to Bayside, and glad that we could bring our 5 children with us. It was quite an adventure getting here, actually. We left on Thursday, and our plan was to come and be here by Friday, and we made it 30 minutes away from our home before our van broke down. But I was very grateful that we were only 30 minutes away from our home because we had family. My father came, speaking of Father's Day, my father came and rescued us, and so we got our van fixed and left the next day. But so happy to be here. And we are going to look at Mark chapter 5, starting in verse 21. And we're going to see that life is often difficult. We encounter disease, death, the issues of living in a fallen world. How do we walk through those issues with faith? And what effect does faith have whenever we are met with these trials and tribulations that we come across in life? And so Mark chapter 5, verse 21 to 6:6 is going to answer that question. And we are going to look first at faith and its effect, and then we're going to look at a lack of faith and its effect, and then how we respond to that. So let's jump in here to the presence of faith and its effect in Mark chapter 5, verse 21. So, and when Jesus crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. And so in Mark chapter 5, Jesus has just stilled the storm. He's cast out demons. He has just come from a non-Jewish territory and back into the Jewish territory. And in the Gospel of Mark, it's very well ordered. Chapter 1 through 8:30, we're learning about who Jesus is. Who is this Jesus? Who is the Messiah? And Peter comes to the conclusion, along with the other disciples, that Jesus is the Christ. He is the Messiah. And then from that point on, Jesus is teaching them about what the Messiah came to do, because they had an incorrect assumption about the Messiah, what he would be like. And so he tells them in Mark chapter 10, verse 45, that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so as we go through the Gospel of Mark, the disciples are learning who Jesus is, what he came to do, and what it means to follow him. If he came to be a servant, then those who are going to follow him are going to be servants. And so we're still in this section where we are learning about who Jesus is. And so that's where we are in Mark chapter 5. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well." And so what we have here is we're going to be looking at the faith of an unnamed woman. But before that happens, we have this man, Jairus, who comes to Jesus. He's a ruler of the synagogue. He falls at Jesus' feet and says, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come lay your hands on her." And so Jairus believes that Jesus can make this child well. But it's urgent. She's at the point of death. He wants Jesus to come right now and heal his little daughter. And so Jesus leaves, and he's on the way. And it says, and he went with him, and a great crowd followed him and thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, and who had suffered much under many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was no better, but rather grew worse. And so we've been introduced to this man, Jairus, and then we see this woman. She's not named the way that Jairus is named. She's not wealthy the way that Jairus is wealthy. She's not influential the way that Jairus is influential. They're the opposite in almost every single way, Jairus and the woman. And this woman, she has suffered for 12 years. a long time. And she spent all that she had on physicians. And so she'd heard the reports about Jesus. She had heard the reports about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I will be made well. And so this woman had heard the reports about Jesus and was so confident that he could make her well that all she had to do was touch his garments. She didn't even think that she needed to talk to him or that he needed to lay his hands on her or even know who she was. And her plan was to keep it that way, to touch his garments, to be made well, and never bother Jesus at all. And this is what she does. It says, and immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And so she was made well. She was made whole. And this is what she had wanted. So she believed that this would happen. And verse 30, Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? So this is amazing because, again, Jesus didn't agree to this miracle, right? Now, we can talk about his omnipotence and his omniscience and that he's God, but he didn't agree to this miracle. He's walking. She comes up behind him, touches his garments, and is immediately healed. Now, what's interesting is that for her to have this discharge of blood for 12 years, that's not only a physical ailment, but it would have rendered her unclean according to Jewish law. And so she would have been outside the community because there was a process when a woman was bleeding, there was a process for coming back into the community, being cleansed and coming back into the community. It wasn't a sin issue, but it was a purity issue. But if she has this for 12 years, she's on the outside then of the community for 12 years. And anything she touched would be unclean. But when she goes and touches Jesus' garments, it goes the other way. Rather than Jesus being made unclean, he makes her clean. He makes her well. And so this is not just a physical healing, but it's making her whole. And so Jesus, he wants to know who touched my garments. And so he wants to highlight this woman and her faith. He's not content with just keeping on going and leaving her anonymous. And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing around you, and yet you say, who touched me? The disciples. Man, the disciples. You're reading through Mark and you're thinking, oh, come on, guys. Really? I mean, Jesus has stilled the storm. He's cast out demons. I think he knows what he's talking about. You might not understand, but for them to say, gee, come on, Jesus, look at all these people. How can you even ask that question? Everybody's touching your garments. Look at this. You expect us to know exactly who? And I love Jesus' reaction because he doesn't even address them. He just keeps looking around to see who had done it. He totally ignores the disciples. He'll deal with them later. They've still got to learn things, but that's not what he's about right now. He wants to know who touched his garments. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease. And so this woman who had wanted to remain anonymous is called out by Jesus. She comes and she falls at his feet. She acknowledges who Jesus is. So when she's coming to Jesus for healing, she's not using him. You know, there were issues that Jesus had to deal with where people would follow him because he would feed them or he would heal their disease, but they weren't interested in him and his person and his work. But this woman believed, and she falls at his feet in worship and tells him the whole truth about how she had come to touch his garment and how she had been ill for 12 years and how as soon as she touched his garment, she was healed. And so Jesus addresses her as daughter. And so this woman, she's an unnamed woman, but Jesus calls her daughter. And she's the only one addressed this way by Jesus. And so to Jesus, she is not a nobody. She is not just a poor, unnamed woman, and here's Jairus, the important man of the synagogue. To him, she is a daughter. And she's been made well. She's been made whole. And why? It's because of her faith. It's because of her faith. Now, we'll get to this because it's important that we define what that faith is and why she could be so confident that she would be healed. But we'll keep going. It was because of her faith. So this has interrupted our story that we had begun. Because remember, we haven't left Jairus. Jairus came to him. That's why Jesus was on his way. And so Jesus is interrupted and Jairus is interrupted. So we go back to the beginning. And when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet, similar to the woman, and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be made well and live." And he went with him. And then Jesus takes time to talk to this woman. Now, if you're Jairus, and you have a daughter who's at the point of death, who's going to die soon if Jesus doesn't come, the time is of the essence here. I'd be saying, Jesus, let's go. Let's go. She's healed. Great. Let's keep going. My daughter's sick. And so Jairus is going to meet with some discouragement and some delay. So Jesus stops, he addresses this woman, and then, verse 35, while he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further?" And so Jesus has just turned and addressed this woman as daughter. So he says, "Daughter, you are made well." And then they come and say, "Jairus, your daughter is dead." We have one daughter who's been made well and one daughter who has died. I'm sure to Jairus at that moment, there would be a lot of discouragement. And as we go through the Christian life, there can be a lot of discouragement. And I recently took up skateboarding. Yeah. Why are you laughing? Because I'm 36, and I shouldn't be skateboarding. But I did anyway. And my kids got into it. You know, I bought them a skateboard and they got into it. And I was like, well, I did this a little bit in high school. Maybe I'll get back into it. So I started skating with them. And the thing that you have to know about skateboarding is it takes you forever to get good and it hurts really bad. You have to try the same thing over and over and over and over and over again. I hurt my wrist, months ago. I think it's now just fully healed, right? And you just have to be persistent. You have to keep going. You have to fight through the pain and the discouragement. And there's a lot of people in my life, not my wife, she's very encouraging, but a lot of people in my life who are like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? You should quit. And that's the way it is in the Christian life oftentimes. It's a difficult road. It hurts. You have to keep going. And there's a lot of discouragement and delay. And people around you like this Jairus' friends are going to say, give up. Give up. It's over. Don't trouble the teacher any further. Your daughter is dead. So what does Jairus do? Well, we know that Jairus keeps on going because we see here in verse 36, but overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, "Do not fear, only believe." And so we have this issue of belief, faith. So Jairus, don't give in to this fear. Keep believing. And we know that Jairus does that because of the end of the story. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. And when he had entered, he said to them, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. So here again we have discouragement. Jesus uses this word for sleeping, which is a different word. Very, very oftentimes in the New Testament, the word for sleeping is a euphemism for death, and that's a certain word for sleeping. This is the regular word for sleeping, like you go to sleep and you wake up in the morning. And Jesus uses that word not because the child is not dead. We know that the daughter is dead, and we'll see that. But he's pointing out that this is temporary, that she's going to get up, and not just later in the resurrection, right now. It's like she's just sleeping. And they laugh at him. They're like the disciples. What do you mean, who touched you? Jesus, what are you thinking? These people, what are you thinking, Jesus? She's not sleeping. And again, kind of like the disciples, he doesn't even really address them. He's has a mission here that he's going to keep on. Verse 40, continuing, but he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. And so the mother and the father are there. They continue with him. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, Talitha Kumi, which means, little girl, I say to you, arise. And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And so Jesus brings them in. He takes the little girl by the hands, and Mark uses the Aramaic phrase, Talitha Kumi. Now, he could have just said, Jesus said, little girl, arise. I mean, all of this is translated from Jesus' speaking Aramaic or Greek. But whenever you have a story and you want to draw people into the story, it's like sometimes when I tell a story that happened to us in Hungary, and somebody will say something in Hungarian at the high point of the story. Sometimes when I'm telling the story, I'll say the word or the phrase in Hungarian and then I'll translate it. And so you can see Mark writing this when Peter related this story, when John related this story, they would say this, Talitha Kumi, because when Jesus did this, they saw a girl get up from the dead. That was just burned into their mind, as of course it would be. And it says here that she started walking around because she was 12 years of age. Now, whenever you're reading stories, authors, good authors, they don't put in details for no reason. Mark isn't just giving us a trivia, by the way, she was 12. Or she started walking just because that's an interesting piece of trivia. He connects this with the woman who had been suffering for 12 years. And so what Mark is telling us is that these two stories, they go together. And he's connecting the faith of the woman and the faith of Jairus together and the results of those faith. And what was the results of that faith? It was healing. It was resurrection from the dead. And so that is the presence of faith and its effect. Now, what this does not mean is that if we have enough faith, we will be healed. Or if we have enough faith, the person that we want to live will live. I have a mentor who said they're called miracles, not ordinaries. So you don't expect miracles, or else it's not a miracle. Miracles are unexpected. I believe God can do miracles. I believe He does. I pray. My pastor, I'm sure my dad has shared, he has terminal cancer. I pray that the Lord would heal him, and I know that the Lord can. But that's not my expectation. I will praise Him if it happens. But why could the woman and why could Jairus be so sure that Jesus would heal? Well, it's because they knew who Jesus was, and He was there with them. He was present with them. We're waiting for Jesus to return. So we're not at the same point in history where we can expect this right now, even though we ask Him for it. But it's still important that we see the faith, because that is going to be applicable to us. That faith that Jairus and the woman had. But we're going to see the absence of faith and its effect. Because right after this story, Mark relates the story of the Nazarenes. Chapter 6. He went away from there and came to his hometown, and his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given him? How are such mighty works done by his hand? Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. And so what they're saying here is, we know who this is. This is no special person. They're not amazed at his miracles and his mighty works in a good way. They're not astonished in a good way. They're saying, who does this guy think he is? We know who he is. He's just a regular guy. They took offense at him. This isn't like he hurt their feelings. This is always negative in Mark, and it's always applied to people who do not believe in Jesus. Those who take offense at Jesus are those who do not believe in him. They don't believe he's the Messiah. They don't believe he's the Son of God. He's just a carpenter. So Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his relatives and in his own household. And that's, we could say, familiarity breeds contempt. So they're so familiar with him, they grew up with him, that they can't see him for who he really is, or they don't see him for who he really is, and they don't believe. So what's the effect? What is the effect of a lack of faith? And he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them, and he marveled because of their unbelief. Now this is really amazing that it says he could do no mighty work there. What do you mean he could do no mighty work there? Of course Jesus could. He's calmed the storm. He's cast out demons. He's the one in control. He's sovereign. And so I think that's one reason why Mark adds this, he laid his hands on a few sick people, which is only for Jesus could that be a throwaway line. Well, yeah, he healed some people, right? And I think the point is that Jesus limited himself in response to their faith. Jesus chose that he would not do mighty works there because he had chosen to do those in response to faith. And so because of that, he doesn't do mighty works here, and he marvels at their unbelief, and then he goes out among the villages teaching. And this is the last time in Mark that Jesus goes into a synagogue. After this, he doesn't return into a synagogue. So this is a huge break in the Gospel of Mark. And so we see that the woman and Jairus, they got to see God's healing. They got to see restoration. They got to see resurrection from the dead. They got to see mighty works because they believed in who Jesus was. And the Nazarenes didn't, because they didn't believe in who he was and what he had come to do. And so the effect was not experiencing that wellness, that wholeness that can come with trust in Jesus. And so what do we do as disciples? Well, we need to choose to believe that Jesus will bring restoration. And so the disciples are being taught who Jesus is. And this story highlights for us who he is. And we see it, the correct response in Jairus and the woman. And the question to the disciples is, who are you going to be like? Are you going to be like Jairus and the woman who fell at Jesus' feet, who believed in him, who knew that he could heal, who knew that he was the Messiah? Or are you going to go with the Nazarenes and not believe that he's the Messiah, believe he's just a normal Jewish man from Nazareth? What are you going to choose? And if you choose to have the faith of Jairus and the woman, you are going to see healing and restoration. If you choose to lack faith like the Nazarenes, you're not going to see that. Now, as I said, we right now, when you get to the end of Mark, after the resurrection of Jesus, Jesus tells them to go back and meet him in Galilee. And so as we going through Mark, it's like we're going with the disciples on the road to the cross. And we're learning just along with the disciples. And then you go back to Galilee and you keep on following Jesus. Because right now is the time of serving. Right now is the time of humility. Right now is the time of persevering through suffering and discouragement and delay. But we know who Jesus is. We see it in the story of Jairus and the woman. And we know that if we have trusted in Jesus, we will see healing and restoration and wholeness. We can be confident of that. Just like Jairus and the woman, we're confident of that. We know that it's coming because of who Jesus is. And so that gives us the endurance, the ability to keep going when times are difficult, when we encounter disease and death and frustration and sadness. because we know that at some point we're going to see Jesus. He's going to say, daughter, son, you're made well. You're made whole. And that's what we're looking forward to. And so as we go through life, we need to have this kind of perspective that Jairus had and that the woman had. And so let's choose to do that. Let me pray for us. Lord, thank you so much for your word. And we thank you for this story that was related to Mark by Peter. And we see this episode in the life of your son, Jesus. And we see his love and his care for this woman and for this man, Jairus, and his daughter. We see the healing and restoration that comes from belief in your son, Jesus. And we're looking forward to that, Lord. We trust, just as the woman and Jairus did, that healing and that restoration will come, that Jesus will bring it, and we are looking forward to that. And I pray as we go through life, as we encounter discouragement, delay, sickness, death, I pray that you would, by your Spirit, remind us of who your Son is and what we're looking forward to, so that we will continue following him in obedience. It's in his name I pray. Amen.